Welcome to a special series of NASP podcasts on social justice. I'm Dan Florell, the NASP Online Communication Coordinator, and I'm pleased to introduce our topic on future of social justice in school psychology, training, practice, and research with our moderator, Sherry Proctor. And I'm going to let Sherry go ahead and take over from here and introduce all of our wonderful participants for today's podcast.
Thank you, Dan, for that introduction. First, I would like to introduce myself. I am Dr. Sherry Proctor, an Associate Professor of School Psychology at Queens College, City University of New York. My research centers on increasing racial diversity in school psychology, primarily through research projects designed to understand how students of color experience school psychology training and what efforts can be taken to recruit and retain these students. Today, I am honored to welcome 6 incredible students, practitioners, and researchers to the final SP4SJ podcast to engage in a discussion about the future of school psychology training, practice, and research in social justice. Joining us today are Dr. Anne Gregory, Brittany Johnstone, Sujay Sobnis, Dr. Dave Schreiberg, Dr. Stacy Williams, and Justina Yohanan. First, I will begin by introducing Dr. Anne Gregory. Dr. Gregory is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University. She is a researcher and a practitioner in the area of racial and gender disparities in discipline and is currently examining school-wide restorative practices and equity-oriented social and emotional learning in schools. Her research has focused on the persistent trend that African American adolescents are issued school suspension and expulsion at higher rates than adolescents from other groups. Through program development and evaluation, Dr. Gregory aims to improve K-12 educational settings for students from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. I'm also pleased to have Brittany Johnstone. Brittany is an early career school psychologist in Baltimore, Maryland. Brittany is interested in exploring how school psychologists can partner with teachers to use our collective voices to advocate for policies at the local, state, and federal level that support our most neglected populations. Because of her passion for social justice, she is invested in addressing the discrimination students face in our school systems and the injustices they face in their communities as well. We also have Sujay Sobnis. Sujay is a doctoral candidate in the school psychology program at the University of South Florida. Sujay is currently finishing up his internship at Hillsborough County Public Schools in Tampa, Florida, and he's working on his dissertation. He is interested in critical qualitative research, and he draws on critical race theory to understand the role of racial ideologies and discourses among teachers and school psychologists. We also have with us Dr. Dave Schreiberg, who is a professor of school psychology at Indiana University. His research and teaching interests center on application of social justice principles to school psychology. I'm also very pleased to welcome Dr. Stacy Williams, who's an assistant professor of psychology at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. She's a licensed psychologist and a nationally certified school psychologist. Dr. Williams is involved in social justice initiatives, training, and research at the tertiary level. Last, but certainly not least, we have Justina Yohanan. She is a doctoral candidate at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan. Her current research relates to evidence-based interventions, specifically in the area of trauma. She is also focused on social justice and the connection between knowledge provided by training and research and action. So to begin, I would like to ask Dave, who's done foundational work in the field related to defining social justice, to highlight the key features of social justice for school psychology. I know that NASP recently put forth a definition of social justice and adopted social justice as a strategic goal for the organization's work. So it's really important for listeners and for us to understand what we're talking about here. Dave?
Thanks so much, Tracy. It's such an honor to be on this podcast with all these leaders in social justice and school psychology. So as you said, NASP has done a lot of work around social justice historically, and also particularly in the last few years with the start of the Social Justice Task Force in 2016. And one of the outgrowths of the task force was a definition of social justice, which NASP adopted in April of last year, of 2017. I won't read the whole definition, but I would say if you want the full definition, it's laid out beautifully on NAS's website. But some of the main areas to highlight, social justice can be hard to categorize. So I'm going to put forth a couple ways of categorizing it that I think are consistent with the existing research and with NAS's definition of social justice. So as far as some of the main topic areas of defining social justice, there are three that I would highlight. One component of social justice has to do with resource allocation, also sometimes referred to as distributive justice. So how our resources are used. In our case, as school psychologists, we're primarily interested in resources used at the school and community level. Another way of thinking about social justice is what's called procedural justice. So social justice can be about the processes we use to make decisions, whether it's special education evaluations, discipline decisions. So it can be very process oriented. And finally, a third way to categorize social justice is through the lens of relational justice. And this is where the different isms would come into play. So you can imagine a school maybe that allocates their resources in a way that we might say is equitable and just, has just processes, follows the law on their procedures, but tolerates homophobic bullying, or in day-to-day interaction, students are exposed to microaggressions. So a third kind of major category of social justice has to do with relationships, how we treat one another, both individually and systemically. So what might social justice look like in practice? Again, I'll highlight three primary areas. One way to think about social justice application to practice is that social justice, it's an aspirational goal. So one of the things I've always loved about school psychology, draw for me, and I think my experience as a professor draw for every student that I've ever met, it's a service profession. You don't come into school psychology for riches, for fame, for money, right? But for the benefit of others. So social justice, I think, has the potential to be something that we all strive for. And my vision of social justice might be slightly different than other people on the panel, but it's something that motivates us, particularly in periods of struggle as school psychologists. So one way to think about applying social justice is as an aspirational goal. A second main way would be to think of it as a filter, and this really comes from multiculturalism. So it's having kind of a critical lens on the information we take in. I think of work such as Dr. Gregory's around disparities in school discipline as one example of that. So you could have the school discipline data, but if you're not thinking about it from a critical perspective, you may miss kind of the bigger picture and opportunities for advocacy. The last thing I would say is, I like to say that social justice is a verb. It's something that we do. So what that looks like when we're doing, I would say is emerging as far as school psychology literature. Often the idea of advocacy recurs. The NAS definition describes it this way: school psychologists enact social justice through culturally responsive professional practice and advocacy to create schools, communities, and systems that ensure equity and fairness for all children and youth. School psychology has been engaged in advocacy probably ever since the field has begun, and certainly NAS does a lot of advocacy. I would distinguish social justice advocacy as advocacy that deals openly with issues of power, privilege, and oppression. There's sort of implied critique of the status quo, particularly when that status quo supports injustice. So I apologize, I know it's a long-winded answer. It's hard to really, I think, wrap your mind around social justice, so I hope those two categorization systems are helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave. I really like the fact that you highlighted the difference between advocacy and in terms of social justice and critiquing the status quo. I think that's a very important part of social justice. So now that we're on the same page about what social justice can mean to school psychology, I would like for you all to consider what social justice might look like in terms of the future of school psychology training, practice, and research. Sujay, you are nearing the end of your doctoral internship and your formal training in school psychology. Looking back, but also thinking ahead, and based on your experiences, where do you see social justice headed in terms of training? How do we actualize that aspiration Dave discussed earlier? So, essentially, from your perspective as a student, what can be done at the program level?
So, I mean, just looking back at my experiences, I felt like there was a lot to be desired in like the curriculum that I was introduced to that dealt with like issues of social justice and racism. So there was some inclusion or name checking of diversity and multiculturalism, but it seemed to be at a very superficial level. So like, okay, we have said diversity twice, so let's check it off our list. So I definitely had to look like outside of school psychology and take a whole lot of classes outside of school psychology, and also connect to people from other departments such as like women and gender studies, critical pedagogy, etc., to get this in-depth understanding of the processes involved in like racial oppression, gender oppression, homophobia, etc. And so I don't think that this is something that's specific to my program or even university, and based on my conversations with like other students from other programs, many of them feel the same way. So going forth, I feel like this pressure on programs to include social justice will continue to build, to kind of include it in their curriculum. And then the debate may no longer be about whether we should include social justice in our curriculum, but rather like how do we get on this diversity trend while doing the least possible amount of work. And so that being said, I do think there'll be a few like standout programs who will come to take on a more vigorous and passionate role about teaching their students about social justice. And these are the programs that will move the field forward. So just to answer your question about how to go about actualizing the aspiration, I think it's important for training programs to question their intentions and why they're doing what they're doing, why they're teaching what they're teaching, and just how much time, energy, and resources they're willing to dedicate to help students become active agents of social justice, because I feel like it will take a lot more than one summer course in cultural competence to do that.
Thank you, Sujay. Those are some very, very important points, I think, for us to consider as we move forward. Justina, what are your thoughts based on your training thus far? Any specific areas of training we should be targeting in the future to initiate or strengthen social justice training in our field?
So I definitely agree with Sujay in that we need to be incorporating social justice throughout our curriculums, even beyond just having a single course and having it definitely dug deep in there and having that focus. But even before that, I think first and foremost, we need to be recruiting individuals from diverse backgrounds. Because if you look at our field, it's fairly one note. We do have our little splatterings of diversity, but for the most part, it's female, Christian, white, and straight. And so we need to be going out into these undergrad courses, going into ethnic groups and recruiting these individuals who would really have a lot to give to our field, who would really be able to connect with the kids that we work with the families that we work with. And so I think that's a major part of what we need to do and start focusing on as well. And I know back in, I think it was 2009, NASP had a statement that said that this is a major area that we need to focus on, the recruitment piece, and we need to continue doing so. And then after that, once we get these diverse individuals into our programs, we need to make the environment safe, and we need to cultivate it so that it gives these students the opportunity to grow into competent school psychologists who have that focus on social justice, who feel safe and supported in their programs.
Very nice. I think you just summed up my research agenda in like 5 seconds, so thank you there. I'll look for something else to do now. Stacey, I know that you are the co-chair of Social Justice Committee for the Trainers of School Psychologists Group, and you've done training around social justice at the state and national level. What are your thoughts about what interdisciplinary approaches need to be taken when we consider engaging social justice training for future school psychologists?
You know, I really liked what Sajai said about the fact that he had to go outside of his department to increase his social justice pedagogy, right? So you went to women's study, because traditionally in school psych, we've talked about multicultural issues or diversity issues in one class, right? There are not many programs where social justice issues are integrated throughout the program. And so my focus is primarily on, you know, like, so we can put it in the curriculum, we can recruit students of color, but Justina, how do we create those safe space, right? You create safe space by building capacity in your trainers. Because if we look at our trainers are white, our trainers are male and female, and there's not a lot of diversity within the trainers of school psychology. Yet we're expecting the trainers to integrate and or talk about social justice issues in the curriculum. It's really important for us to understand that many of our trainers don't know how to do that. They don't have access to the language or the vocabulary to engage and or to create safe spaces. So one of the things that we've done at our university for several different reasons, dealing with like cultural taxation of our faculty of color, dealing with issues of race or racism on campus, dealing with our faculty of color being always the one who's asked to mentor students of color and majority faculty about dealing with social justice issues, we've decided to build capacity within our teaching force, right? And we've done that using what Sajai actually suggested, using an interdisciplinary approach. So if you think about, I'm a systems level consultant, so I always think at the systems level, right? How can you design processes and or policies to support the allocation of resources at the systems level? So we are housed in a School of Social Behavioral Sciences. So think about where your schools are housed in your department. We have access to social workers, we have access to teacher educators, we have access to criminal justice individuals. If you think about school psychology when we're practicing with social workers, we're practicing with teachers. And if you're in a school that's using a PINS process where you're getting the law involved, at some point you're going to be interacting with the criminal justice system. So from an interdisciplinary level, we're bringing together all of these trainers, and the majority of my colleagues are white, and we're coming together and we're talking about, you know, what are the social justice issues within your field, and then we're creating curriculum for our trainers, for our faculty members, who are basically developing their pedagogy so that they can integrate social justice theories throughout the curriculum, and Justina, to your point, so that they have language to create inclusive space so that all students are able to grow in their awareness in this particular environment.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Sounds like I hear you saying the definite need for the trainers of school psychologists to be equipped with the language, the knowledge, the skills to be able to actually implement
Exactly.
This framework of social justice in our programs. And you identify as a school psychology graduate educator as well as a practitioner. Based on your experience in those two roles, do you see how work from other fields might influence how school psychology educators conceptualize and or implement social justice training in the future?
Yes, I mean, I think that all of us need to have a deep appreciation and consideration for a range of fields. So what comes to mind right out of the gate is sociology, for instance. So Stacey, you mentioned that being a systems thinker, and I think we all talk a lot about systems in our school psych training in general. But I think it can sometimes it's outside of the notion of thinking about power and privilege. And I think sociology, however, often lands kind of squarely in thinking from a more social kind of critical standpoint. And it can really push school psychologists to consider larger systems that are rooted in a socio-historical background so that we can understand how inequality operates today. That it's really, it's not all at the relational justice piece, that it's not all I think it's easy for folks to kind of move to a space around interpersonal relations or differential treatment in school. We also really have to think about differential access. So when we're thinking about education, the idea of kind of systematic institutionalized racism and how it's created inferior schooling that arises today in our very economically and racially segregated public system that we have. The field of education, I also have a great appreciation for working with teacher educators around instructional practices. So like many of us, we think about the social and emotional aspects of learning and also obviously educational needs, but understanding more from a kind of a tier 1 perspective, best practice around rigorous, engaging instruction, to me, is all about social equity and justice. This notion of who has access to highly engaging, rigorous classrooms, and what are the kinds of practices that can that some students are systematically denied. So I think my mind goes straight to both sociology and education as key fields that should be feeding into a more of our psychological orientation towards schooling.
Mm-hmm. Definitely agree with you. Definitely. Brittany, I would like to transition our discussion to thinking more deeply about the future of social justice and the practice of school psychology. So Brittany, you spend your days as a practitioner in Baltimore. Will you briefly share what you view as a couple of the most pressing social justice issues that the kids, families, and schools you service deal with on a daily basis?
Certainly, yeah. So, two really big things come to mind for me. The first being this ongoing challenge of the gap between research and implementation, and how there are just never enough hours in the day, and it is very hard to carve out time for social justice work. Maybe you have a couple teachers in the building who are also passionate about that, and they're willing to incorporate that into consultation practices. But primarily, I get around that by thinking about how to look at the systemic changes we can make, which is where lobbying and advocacy come into play for me, not just at the federal level about, increasing more mental health funding for mental health providers, but also at my state, city, local level of what can we do to make sure that people see the importance of incorporating mental health and social justice into our schools, and not just thinking about the usual issues of housing and health, but also, a big issue in Baltimore City is lead poisoning. I had to do a lot of research about understanding the impact of lead poisoning. And from my perspective, it's 2018. Like, what are we doing with that? The other issue that I see as being really important is resources need to be targeted at the populations that we're working with. And I've seen this a lot lately come up in our conversations about suicide prevention and intervention and school safety. And a lot of the resources that are being put out, not just by NASP, but by other organizations, have a very kind of mainstream feel to them, and they're not targeted at the populations that I work with, and that the data are showing us need to be addressed. I think specifically of the CDC data that recently came out that talked about the suicide rates of Black children ages 5 to 12 being roughly double that of their white peers. But suicide prevention and intervention resources are largely targeted at, white suburban populations. And that becomes an issue of, as a practitioner, having to translate those documents on the fly versus having them available for me at ease.
That's really, really interesting. What do you think, I heard you speak about resources, but in terms of like what you might view as your greatest challenge to kind of embracing a social justice orientation to practice, what do you think is your greatest challenge, and how do you think our profession might support you in the future in meeting your aim of being a practitioner who uses a social justice frame to practice?
Sure. I think the biggest challenge is when I go into social justice spaces, maybe it's community organizations, I'm often the only school psychologist in the room, even if it is an education-focused group. So it could be a group like Teacher Democracy Project, which focuses on how to advocate for students, but I'm the first school psychologist that they've met. So it comes back to what I think Justina was saying, and also Sujay, about making sure our programs are emphasizing how important social justice work is, so that people are coming into the field prepared to do that work and partner with teachers, kind of like Anne was speaking about.
Sujay, you're almost finished with your internship, and you've had experience in a different part of the country than Brittany. What are some of the most pressing social justice issues you see as an intern in Florida?
So Florida was one of the leaders in the whole school choice movements, like school vouchers and all those kinds of things. And, research has shown that a lot of those, the vouchers and school choice, it kind of feeds into white flight. So you have a lot of white parents who will take the vouchers to, take their kids out of, schools that have a fairly like diverse non-white population and kind of use those vouchers to flee to, more suburban schools. So there's definitely, I'm seeing a lot of like white flight, and also there's gentrification. So you had schools which were, so far had been like very kind of diverse and had a diverse staff, diverse student body, diverse parent body. And now you have many of those families being pushed out by like the forces of gentrification. So those are just some of the things I'm seeing. Another thing I also, because I'm not from US, so it was a nice learning experience for me, some of the things I got to see. But also in terms of curriculum, like I was observing this elementary classroom, and one of the lessons was the pros and cons, and they combined that with social studies. So the history topic was colonization of Florida by the Spanish. So the task for the students was to come up with the pros and cons of colonization, and then the teachers kind of guided them through what are the nice things that happened with colonization, how the natives got so many skills and they learned so many things, and the cons were like some of them got diseases. And so it was just interesting, this kind of curriculum that is kind of used to indoctrinate kids and into this kind of system of white supremacy. So yeah, those are just some of the top things that come to mind, but I'm sure there are like a lot more.
Yeah, I think that example of colonization is a very interesting example, and I think it is indicative of you as a practitioner who uses social justice as a practice frame to go into a classroom and see that taking place, and to understand that that is indeed a social justice issue, something that perhaps we might discuss challenging in terms of thinking about curriculum and how curriculum is framed and presented to students in schools. Dave, what does research tell us about facilitators and challenges to early career school psychologists who are attempting to engage in social justice in their professional practices?
Yeah, there's emerging literature in this area. I'd say there's maybe about a half dozen studies or so approximately in school psychology that have spoken to the dynamic of graduate students, early career professionals. What you tend to find, particularly in relation to more experienced school psychologists, is that early career school psychologists are, as a group, obviously there are individual exceptions, but as a group, tend to be pretty open and engaging in the ideas of social justice. A lot of them are more familiar with that language and see engagement activism as part of their role, or in case of graduate students, see that as part of their future role. But it's hard, for many of them, it's hard to know what to do with that energy and desire relative to school psychology. They're enthusiastic for the field, they have different degrees of training and feeling of confidence around that, but my sense is that a lot of the early experiences tend to go a long way with the early career psychologists and early career school psychologists that have talked about having success often will speak to mentorship training. So either as graduate students, perhaps they were pushed out of their cultural comfort zone in some way, or they had good mentorship in the field. So I think those early experiences tend to go a long way. Now, more experienced school psychologists, and this came out most clearly in a NASS study from about 10 years ago that had randomly selected members of NASS as participants. The more experienced school psychologists as a group were a little less likely to be sort of broadly endorsing the idea of social justice, but those that did tended to have, at least in my judgment as the researcher, sort of more detailed and nuanced view of how they might bring that into practice. So it's not that the early career professionals don't want to do that, but they don't have the experience yet. So they have the desire and different degrees of skills and confidence, but haven't had the experience of carrying a lot of it out, whereas more veteran school psychologists are more likely to have the experience and can speak in a little more detail and systemically about their work, but we found them to be slightly less thinking about social justice at the front of their brain. So again, this research is still emerging, but that's what the picture looks like, at least to me so far.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that early career school psychologists particularly have difficulty thinking about challenging systems and structures that may be discriminatory or oppressive to certain marginalized populations? Is that something that has been found? And also, Dave, feel free to answer this. Sujay, Justina, Brittany, your experiences with this, thoughts? Dave?
Yeah, I think it can feel really daunting. The point was raised before that the field is predominantly white, female. School psychologists as a group tend to come disproportionately from privileged categories within the United States. And if you have, I would argue, if you have really good training around social justice as a graduate student in early career, there'd be points where you have these sort of awakenings. At least I can speak to this as a white male. When I first became aware of white privilege, I went through sort of several stages of sort of denial, anger, frustration, and then you're like, this is really daunting. And I think persons that have grown up experience oppression, or they're already aware of it, and they may or may not have an optimistic view about being able to change some of those things. But I think particularly for people that my experience in school psychology is that you go from being, you don't know what you don't know, then you start to be aware of some things that you don't know, but it's hard to know what to do about that. And so it can be, for some people, very motivating, but for other people it can be kind of paralyzing and frustrating. And I know in teaching about social justice, I want students to be aware of racism, classism, and how deeply embedded those are. But to the point that school psychologists are often the only one in the building, you shouldn't have the idea that like, oh, you and you alone can solve racism. You and you alone can solve class. I think sometimes in your early in your career, or if you're just getting motivated and knowledgeable around a topic the first time, there's a sense of like wanting to change it and taking a lot of responsibility on yourself, which I think is desirable, but can be, for people, it can paralyze them a little bit until they have the skills of like thinking about, okay, how do we work on this collectively with other people?
Justina, any thoughts about that idea of challenging systems as you think about going out into the field? Any anxiety or thoughts about how that might be accomplished?
Oh, there's definitely anxiety because it is a daunting task. And as to how it can be accomplished, I think it's small baby steps. And a lot of it's going to be hand-holding, especially for people who haven't experienced expression like Dave talked about earlier. It's a lot to go through and to sort of process. So we need to be doing this in our training program so that they're not sort of thrown into the world and having to deal with it for the first time when they're working with minority students or clients or whoever it is they're working with. And there are certain programs, so there are like dialogue programs on how to have appropriate dialogues and how to sort of combat and disrupt bias. So those exist. I know that the University of Michigan does some dialogue work on that. So implementing that into our field and sort of having that training in place so that people know how can you potentially talk about this in a way that won't just be combative, that won't be just a debate where no one's listening to the other side and there's no progress being made. How can you talk about this in a way that people are actively listening to each other and understanding each other's experiences? And then moving on from there to, it's the empathetic piece. We focus so much on empathy in our field and we sort of need that. And to listen to each other's voices is important, especially when it comes to minority individuals who are so often silent. So going into the systems level and making sure we're listening to the families, we're listening to the parents, we're listening to people's experiences and taking that very seriously. How to do that at systems level, I'm not quite as well aware of, but it's individually becoming interested in this information, becoming interested in listening to other people's experiences and wanting to do this is very important. And I think that want, that desire to want to be able to do this, that is something that can be built in a school psych program. Because if you aren't given this in your training, the likelihood that you're going to go out and seek this out on your own is not going to be as high because you just haven't been exposed to it. You don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And your work is really all about going into schools and helping people kind of understand where inequities exist in terms of behavior and discipline. And what have you experienced just from a practice lens in terms of challenging some of those systems where African American kids are disproportionately disciplined and expelled from schools?
I have learned that we need to work, as Dave mentioned, collectively, but also courageously in a sustained way. A concern I have is that, especially in school discipline reform, it's very easy to get kind of pushed back towards a punitive model of discipline, that towards the kind of lack of recognition of the punitive treatment or criminalization of kids of color, right? So I think we can there's a lot of political forces, school boards, et cetera, that are really pushing towards homeostasis. And so a system that gets disrupted is going to keep pulling towards homeostasis. Let's get back to the way things were. Even if it was kind of broken, many people see the way things were around kind of overuse of school suspension as broken, but others feel as well it's efficient, right? And it's what we know. So I guess what I have learned, and I've talked a lot more with school districts who are reforming their school discipline policy, is being slow and steady and increasing buy-in from the bottom and the top. That kind of bottom up and top down change. We need student activists on board, family or grassroots organizing, teacher buy-in, school psychologist buy-in at every level, but also we need courageous leaders with vision. And I would include that with the school psychologists in the building who take on systems level change, is to really articulate a vision for change, grab some allies, link arms, and know that the system's going to resist, just because we know that social change is so hard, that privilege can, people cling on to privilege or a sense of privilege.
Very important points, I think, for us to think about. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to transition the conversation to talk about research and the future of social justice in school psychology research. As scholars and scientist practitioners, all of us are immersed in the research to some extent. First, I'm kind of curious about our two doctoral candidates, Justina and Sujay. What are their thoughts about the future direction of research in terms of social justice? I know you both are doing some really great work that I would definitely say falls under the social justice umbrella in terms of research. Sujay, what does it mean to you to be a researcher in school psychology who embraces social justice in their work?
It's very difficult, I would say, just because, so much of the research in school psychology has a very kind of a post-positivist quantitative paradigm, and which is considered to be the gold standard for anything for research. So anything less than that is not research, is just ideological bombast or something. So it's just really hard to kind of be working with critical race theory, which comes from that very qualitative tradition. It involves a lot of like storytelling, narrative, discourse analysis, and just these amazing kind of very destabilizing methodologies that have emerged from other fields like sociology, women's and gender studies, post-colonial studies. So many of these, I want to include all these methods in my agenda, but I will never get published. So it's just very hard. But I feel like if I just keep pushing through, maybe someday it will.
Justina, what are your thoughts?
I think Sujay makes a great point in that we're very quantitative focused and we need to be doing more with the narrative. We need to be doing more qualitative work and take that very seriously. And then from there, we can go back to the quantitative stuff and measuring however it is we need to measure. But if you look at our field in comparison to other fields, we don't do the research as much as they do. So we need to start actually doing the work. And it's hard, and it's going to be, I'm sure, difficult to convince certain people to let us do this work, but it needs to get done.
Dave, as a an editor of a journal that publishes a lot of school psychology focused work. What are your thoughts in terms of what Sujay was saying in terms of work not getting published? Where do you think we should head in terms of social justice in our journals?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. When I've experienced that, so I've submitted work related to social justice to school psychology journals for about the last 15 years or so, and I think I've submitted to just about all of them at some point or another. And it's always interesting to me. There's always going to be some variation inherent in any kind of journal review process, but you do see a lot of journals that will turn down research simply because it's about social justice and also because it's qualitative. That happens a lot, and I've had the experience of submitting an article qualitative research related to social justice to one journal, and then saying basically this is not research, and turning around and submitting that exact same article to another journal, and it gets accepted. So I think there's a lot of variation, and I think it's very true that whenever topics are aligned or seem to be aligned with like political viewpoints, to me social justice isn't an inherently political, it's a political idea, but it's not necessarily aligned with any particular political party or ideology. That sometimes in the science community say, well, that's out of our purview, or that's not really something that we can study. And certainly for qualitative research, sometimes they say, well, we as a society, we care more about numbers than words, as if numbers are more, as if numbers are inherently superior. So I see that attitude quite a bit in school psychology journals. I think it's getting perhaps slightly better, but I have to say I don't see it being dramatically better, and a lot of it has to do with who the editors are. So for me, moving forward, I'd like for all journals, whether they're NASP related or otherwise, to have that as part of their criteria. Does the editor have a broad vision of what scholarship looks like, and is the editor open to research that speaks to the real world, like social justice research almost invariably does?
And I think if I would add to that, I think what we also need is, not just diversity in terms of like, bodies, but also diversity in terms of like the epistemologies. So, epistemological diversity, so an openness to research that kind of goes beyond the post-positivistic, constraints of or what post-positivism defines research to be. So, and like Dr. Schreiber said, it's also like the gatekeepers to research, predominantly white male and coming from that very kind of Eurocentric, idea of like research as an instrumental kind of objective enterprise, which kind of constrains what work is allowed to be done or what ideas are allowed to be explored and published.
Where do you all think we should go from here in terms of research and social justice? What would you like to see? What types of studies would you like to see? What type of topics do you think we do not explore enough of in school psychology?
So again, I'm going to more think about the trainers per se, and looking at like program evaluation work, like how do you support trainers who do social justice work at the college level, right? So for example, we know that if you're doing social justice work, if you are teaching a course, there's likely to be resistance in the course. There's likely to be, if you're working in a predominantly white institutions, you may have students who may be really angry with what you're actually covering in the class. And I think Dave suggested some of the emotions that folks actually go through. And then students feeling empowered to wanting to disempower the instructor in the class, right? So looking at research in terms of how do colleges and or universities support their staff in engaging in social justice work, or support their staff in supporting their students to be social justice warriors or advocates, right? And one of the things that I've been thinking about is how do you integrate like school consultation literature with the social justice literature, with systems literature, in looking at the supports at that level for faculty. Because we also think about primarily, and this is probably anecdotal, it might be faculty of color who's probably doing most of the heavy lifting at their particular institutions. And if you think about, most faculty of color are not retained via the tenure process, right? So how do you protect your faculty who do this stuff within that sort of like tenure chain? And one of the things, it's like building awareness, but how do you go about building that awareness? So, you know, we can think about this from the interventionist piece, which, you know, Sajaya and Justina, you guys are actually doing, but we can also think about like, how do you build that capacity so that your trainers are able to support you to do the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Stacy. Anne, did you have thoughts about this?
I believe we need to also focus on equity-oriented implementation processes, right? So I'm concerned that as districts roll out new initiatives, there's very little time and resources devoted to implementation supports and really thinking systematically about how to do the kind of more micro-level classroom-based change to the systems policy change. And my concern is that what can happen is a quick backlash against equity-oriented reforms. With short funding cycles, kind of short attention spans, people wanting quick fixes that are very reductionistic in their approaches, I think we might lose momentum in equity-oriented work. And so to me, I'm very invested in the field of implementation science these days. While yes, we want to look at impacts and outcomes, at this point I think there's so many different initiatives we don't even have a good sense of how to implement them well. We know the kind of train and hope models don't work well with these upfront workshops for educators, and we need a lot more investment and careful understanding of something like moving away from a punitive mindset and discipline can be so fundamental to people's ways of being. We have to understand a lot more about how to create shifts in very core belief systems for folks.
Dave?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I agree with all that's been said, but in one other idea I would bring up in terms of new research or directions for research is just as Dr. Gregory talked about the need to connect more with other fields. I think it's important that as the social justice literature evolves, that it grows outside of the United States as well. When I first, speaking only for myself, when I first started doing social justice research about 15 years ago now, I specifically wanted to do research with school psychologists for school psychology within the United States because it didn't really exist. And we still need to grow that research that's a school psychology kind of centered voice, but a lot of other fields have been thinking about social justice for a long time, and I would really hate to see it'd be a missed opportunity for the school psychology research around social justice to develop in isolation from research that's happening in sociology, counseling psychology, education, and for it to develop without connection to the broader world. I think particularly the topic of child rights is what I see often, to me, reflects social justice principles, and it's the same types of ideas, but with a different language around it. There's a whole literature educators are engaged in around the world that's largely absent from the school psychology literature. So I think just thinking about our work, not only the social justice literature as it exists now is a very US-centered view on social justice, and I think expanding that focus to capture different viewpoints from across the world is really needed in social justice research and school psychology.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time, but Brittany, I would like to give you the actual last word here. I think that we've covered a lot of territory here, but I think one of the things that may be most important is for us to be able to make sure our practitioners are able to do the work, social justice work out in the field, to really make a difference in the lives of kids every day. So what type of research do you think we need in school psychology that would help you in your social justice efforts in your day-to-day practice?
That's a great question. I think back to what Anne just shared about how do we make sure that our practices that we know are promising for especially students of color, populations living in poverty, are being implemented with fidelity so that they're not tried for 6 weeks and then pushed aside. I see that in my day-to-day work with programs like restorative practices and collaborative and proactive solutions, and how teachers are given these agendas and then they're told to do it, and then the follow-up from administration isn't necessarily consistent. And when I'm meeting with them in my consultation work, I'm asking, how can I support you in restorative practices and doing restorative circles work? And they're just frustrated because they don't have the time and the energy to really highlight that practice. And so it becomes the practice is a problem instead of the structure isn't there to support them implementing the practice. I think that is a huge component. I think also in my day-to-day work, I struggle to find research that is relevant to my school psychology work that is about supporting Black girls and how they're targeted by subjective behavior standards and are kind of the hidden push out of the world. I think a lot about the work of Monique Morris and how she is really highlighting how we're not having these conversations about what's happening to our young Black and African American girls and how they are not being really given the support that they need. And that's leading to some pretty shocking and scary outcomes. And that's certainly an issue in Baltimore City that we have to deal with day to day.
Thank you for your thoughts there. So I have to conclude the podcast. I would like to thank each of you for this very engaging discussion around the future of social justice and school psychology training, practice, and research. I've really enjoyed the engagement, and I look forward to seeing how each of you help us as a field move social justice efforts forward. For listeners who are interested in learning more about social justice and school psychology, NASP has resources posted on their website, www.nasponline.org, under the resources and publications link on the main page. You can also follow the hashtag SP4, the number 4, SJ on Twitter for news and happenings related to social justice and education generally and school psychology specifically. Thank you for tuning in to the last SP4SJ podcast in this series.